Great. Thanks to both of you for kicking us off this morning. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker of the day, Dr. Tara Dawson McGuinness. Dr. McGuinness has spent her career working to improve the economic security and well-being of families. She spent almost 2 decades as the executive director of the Center for American Progress Action Fund, and in 2013, President Obama asked her to join his administration to run the organizing and communications effort to sign up millions of Americans for healthcare. While at the White House, she also directed the Task Force on Community Solutions, working to improve how agencies collaborated using data in new ways to tackle entrenched poverty and to deliver results in communities across the country. After her time with the White House, she joined New America as the founder of their New Practice Lab, a research and design lab focused on family economic security. With the New Practice Lab, Tara has developed a new form of public problem solving. She works at the intersection of ideas and on-the-ground experimentation to improve the design and delivery of policies focused on family economic security and well-being. Tara has just published a new book, as I mentioned, with her colleague Hana Schank, Power to the Public, the Promise of Public Interest Technology. I can personally say that it's very interesting and thought-provoking read. The book presents a new blueprint for how governments and nonprofits harness the power of digital technology to help solve the most serious problems of the 21st century. As I mentioned at the beginning of the day, we've organized for people attending our conference to get a copy of her book at no charge in collaboration with the publisher, the Princeton University Press. So we'll place a link to how to do this into the chat, as well as the code that you'll need to use after you put the book in your basket. Not only do I recommend the book highly, but President Barack Obama does also. After reading her book, he tweeted, "Worth a read for anyone who cares about making change happen." Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tara McGuinness.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. I don't know if you can tell through the Zoom that I'm blushing. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes. Great.
I should say there is a Dr. McGuinness in my family. That is not me. But I am Professor Dr. McGuinness is my mom in my family. I'm so delighted to be with you and the New Jersey Big Data Alliance in this 8th annual symposium. Some of the panelists and speakers today and yesterday are among my favorite academics to read and favorite colleagues. As Anne-Marie mentioned, my name is Tara McGuinness. If it's useful to kind of keep this dynamic since we're not in the same room, I can drop some links into the chat about the items that Anne-Marie mentioned. The New Practice Lab that I run at New America is based in Washington, D.C., but we actually have had a deep partnership and ran a public sector sprint for the state of New Jersey, for the New Jersey Department of Labor, to focus on how to improve the experience of paid leave for the families that use New Jersey's paid leave policy. I know that we've got a number of academics, and I teach at Georgetown. New America actually runs a very focused network called the Public Interest Technology University Network. I can see some faces of folks who are in this network. It is a number of us who are teaching many of the things that you are doing in your kind of cross-university collaboration. Basically, how do we use data? How do we bring to our students real live cases? I'll put a link, and a number of your schools are part of this network, but more and more we're trying to collaborate about how we bring the practices that, as you just heard in the last presentation, have expanded so vastly in the last 10 years. How do we make sure that students like mine in the McCourt School of Public Policy are being trained for the world as it is, not for the world as it was when the textbooks on public policy were drafted. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about the power of data, the promise and the peril. In my book with Hana Schank, we really anchor into data as one of 3 practices that are essential for change makers. First, you need to understand the humans you are serving. I think you saw that in the pyramid chart slide that was just up there. If this doesn't work for the consumers or customers, it isn't really going to work over time. Second, that you need data and a specific type of data. We have so much data, we throw around the term, but really need the ability to instrument problem solving in real time. And third, so many governments, organizations, businesses collect a ton of data, but a far smaller fraction of them take this data and use it to change what they do in their decision making. And so the third practice we really talk about is delivery, using data in a way that you see problems and you course correct. But before we jump into that, what I thought I would do, if you will indulge me, I see some folks have repopped their introductions into the chat, is take advantage of this unusual medium in which we are symposing. And if you guys don't mind, I would like to ask you 3 questions, and we'll take them one by one. And you can just take to the all panelists and attendees chat. I'm going to ask you, for the purposes of really trying to, get a sense of who's in the room, to do this in either one word or one sentence. So first question is, in your research organization, company, what do you use data for? So we'll take just 1 minute. And I'm asking you not what you wish you use data for. What do you really use data for? I'm just going to popcorn through. This is really interesting. Confirming decisions, social media, research, public health, contracts, showing the value of a program, national security. There's a breadth. There's a large number of you who use data for research purposes, for cost risk modeling, for understanding your audience. This is really helpful. So I'm going to ask you a second question. Take a pause, which is, what do you aspire to use data for in your research, organizational management work? What do you wish you were using data for? Predictive management, crowdsourcing or remediation, improving our understanding of problems, developing a strategy, organizing our work, focus on productivity, convening of teams. I'll let you guys have another minute without live chatting here. Improve life and work conditions. Planning, justification, production, models of work, how things work. This is really helpful. And I think I'll stop there for a moment. People can keep adding to the chat, and maybe I'll jump right into the talk. But I do this because I think frequently there is, and I think even you can see in our own group gathered this morning, there is a delta between what we do use data for often and what we aspire to use data for. And so frequently, and this is true in my work in my organization, that what we use it for is somewhat functional. What we aspire to use it for is really to change things, right? To improve our decision making. I see here in the chat, to improve work and life conditions, to focus really in on grand challenges, to produce one activity, to predict trends. The things that we wish to use data for so frequently are more in the solving of problem rather than understanding the problem category. So I'm going to jump in this morning, and I aim to talk about kind of 3 or 4 core things. One, data as we describe it in the book is really about real-time data instrumentation to solve problems. A lot of what we were talking about just now in the chat. What do you wish you would use it for? I'm going to talk a little bit about our definition of this kind of problem-solving data. And then I would love to tell you a few stories about what this looks like when it's really succeeding. And I think the stories can be really instructive and animate the meaning of data in the work. And then I want to come back around, and while data is only 1/3 of our book, there is an element that I think is really important to lift up, which is where data falls short. What else you need to layer into the cake to make your strategy effective. And I think there are plenty of demonstrations to look around and see where data alone led us astray. So first, I'm going to ask you, with your eyes open or closed, to kind of picture yourself in the cockpit of a plane. If the idea of being in a cockpit of a plane in the driver's seat is terrifying, picture yourself sliding one over and being kind of the co-pilot. Think about the cockpit of a plane. I love this image, and I think I was first turned on to it by Jen Palka, who used to be the CEO of Code for America. What sort of data instrumentation do you have? You have kind of directional. If you think about the cockpit of a plane, and for a moment everything was covered over, you wouldn't know what direction you were heading. You couldn't tell how fast you were moving. It's terrifying. Frankly, it's how most organizations work in their use of data. I think sussing out, you need directional north, right? You need to know where I am on planet Earth, and also thanks to investment in science over generations, kind of GPS systems, you have a point that you are headed. You have speed, wind speed. You have the ability to monitor other factors, planes that are coming in, other things on your screen. And I want to hold this metaphor into a story about how one community uses data. You may be familiar with an organization called Community Solutions. This is a nonprofit that has evolved and had several turns in its strategy. Very recently, Community Solutions was awarded the MacArthur 100 and Change. They've received $100 million to advance a strategy that they are currently working in over 75 communities to tackle homelessness. I want to tell you a little bit about the story of the strategy and really how community change happens using data. Built for Zero is a campaign of this nonprofit, and they picked their North Star after several iterations, including having a multi-community goal to house 100,000 people who were without housing. This nationwide goal was supported by the Obama administration, and Community Solutions, along with a series of communities, succeeded in housing this multi-year campaign 100,000 people in the same period when the rate of homelessness increased dramatically. So they picked a goal, 100,000 homes. They succeeded. And instead of doing what many organizations might do, a victory lap, they said, this wasn't the right goal. We failed. We need to take a new approach. And in revisiting this, they decided that the ultimate goal wasn't housing a concrete number of people. The ultimate goal needed to be zero homelessness, which is audacious and something that they've achieved in a number of communities. They need to define which category of homelessness. Were they working on, veterans homelessness or family homelessness or chronic homelessness? And they teamed up with dozens of communities who have been part of their 100,000 home campaign to tackle setting a goal of getting to zero. This element of data, having a zero goal, is kind of the first key thing. And I share the story of failure because so frequently you need to organize towards the wrong data goal to understand what the right one was. Second, in addition to their audacious goal, part of the effort that they had done in the 100,000 Homes campaign was to really engage the people they were serving. And so volunteers and community organizations went out and, kind of like a point in time count, went and interviewed and collected the stories of the people in their community who were unhoused. Really seeing them not as numbers on a chart or a piece of data, but as Tara McGuinness, who was unhoused for a reason and who had life goals and ambitions, and really putting a face and story to the name in their data. This is something they did in the communities they work in. They built a by name list of the people who are unhoused in the community and really understand that what it might take to house the first 10 people is very different from what the solution might take to house the last 10 people. So the second part of how they use data is this by name list. The third is they created, using a lightweight tool, inflow and outflow data for the community. So once you have a list, it's also very true that there are seasonal trends and that you would start to discover. But you don't have this with just knowing the rate of homelessness or the sheer number of people who are unhoused in a community. So their third data intervention, and something they use in dozens of cities, is having very accurate inflow and outflow data. And to make this data set, and those of you who are working at the city level on data will know, just to make inflow outflow data required a level of collaboration. Let me tell you a little bit about what this looks like in one city, Rockford, Illinois, where they brought the homeless population, both veterans and chronic, to zero. Rockford is a kind of a typical community. Rockford had struggled after kind of industrialization in the Midwest. And by 2015, Rockford had a pretty chronic homeless population. Hope for Zero teamed up with the mayor and several local community agencies, but to create a by name list involved getting everyone who works with the unhoused around a table. In fact, to be able to even create inflow and outflow data meant that hospitals needed to share the data that they had, that shelters needed to share the data that they had, that the city had other aspects. To make a really functioning data set involved a level of transparency and engagement across public sector, private sector, and nonprofit actors. Creating data definitions was difficult. Creating data sharing was difficult. But 75 communities across the country have, through this collaboration, which would not be possible without really community collaboration across organization, created very effective inflow and outflow data dashboards. Once you could see, in August, we have an uptick. We have an uptick in December. You could manage to new solutions. And you can just imagine that this is not easy. There's no single person in any community for practically any problem that you're solving where there aren't multiple points of entry for how you would assess the full picture. You could look at, everything from COVID to maternal mortality. Often creating a real picture of who you are serving involves bringing people around the table. In Rockford, this changed the problem from being solved from a series of disconnected inputs. Hospitals tracking the number of beds they had, shelters soup kitchens tracking the number of people they feed, others tracking the number of patients they serve who check a box saying that they have housing security issues, into a concrete goal across doctors' offices, hospitals, shelters. Ultimately, this changed the focus from people doing their individual aspect of service, number of beds, number of meals served, towards a single goal across organization: the number of people who remain homeless. I share this story because it demonstrates the depth of what you need to do to even make an excellent data set, right? It doesn't come easy. And actually, even a single community organization saying we prefer to stick with our data set keeps it impossible from seeing the whole picture. The second story I think I'll tell you, and then I can't wait to get into kind of a question and answer. It is about rats. In your neighboring tri-state area, New York City, in 2017, the city undertook an effort to build up their longstanding fight against rats, which I'm sure for New York City, as someone who grew up in this area, is something that happens from time to time. By tapping into 311 call center data, the team figured they could pinpoint where the worst rat problems were in the city and target their abatement efforts there. But when Amin-Ra Mashariki, the chief analytics officer in the mayor's Office of Data and Analytics, looked at the data, he immediately saw something funny. Amin-Ra did what any of us would do looking at a data set. He pinpointed the neighborhood he grew up in and took a deeper dive. Mashariki had grown up in a public housing project in Bedford-Stuy section of Brooklyn, and it still had family members who lived in the neighborhood, and he frequently saw rats. And so it struck him as very strange that there were no real rats present in the data set. basically, no matter which, he sent the data back to his team, asked them to reslice it. And no matter which way the data was sliced, it kept showing very few rats in this neighborhood he knew from personal experience that was rat infested. So he called up an old friend who still lived in this neighborhood and asked, hey, what happened to the rats? According to the city's rat data, there's no rats there. His friend immediately laughed and said, there's plenty of rats here. He said, then why doesn't anyone call 311 to complain? And his friend said, what's 311? I share this story with you, and I'm sure many of you work with 311 data to illustrate not only the importance of validating where your data comes from, not only making sure that drawing conclusions on what is a community problem really represents, often isn't driven by a single data source that may or may not be represented. We know study after study that wealthier white people are more likely to lodge complaints with 311. But also, it's really important to demonstrate that the people parsing the data in your offices, in your organizations, in your research teams, bring and represent a variety of perspectives. In this case, had Mashariki not grown up in a primary low-income neighborhood, he would not have seen the gaps in the 311 data. Thanks to having a chief data lead who was from the community, one of the communities that the city of New York was trying to serve, he was able to press this. But it's a really important piece that I want to mention. This isn't a new problem. In fact, diverse backgrounds have been important to public problem solving going back to the ages. When cholera epidemic gripped London in the 1830s, the source of the epidemic was a mystery. Dr. John Snow, who would have been an unlikely person to locate this source, he was a big shot doctor who attended to Queen Victoria and some of her births. The cholera epidemic was largely confined to poor neighborhoods, so most doctors explained away the outbreak by assuming filthy habits of the lower classes. While Dr. Snow had come to work in Buckingham Palace, he had grown up in a very low-income neighborhood, and he noticed that the poor were dying in disproportionate numbers. He dug in, and in his research, he mapped the outbreak to a single source of a contaminated well. Being from the neighborhood allowed him to see a problem that would be unable to be seen. I think this demonstrates that while we have new metrics of making sure that our teams look like the communities we serve, it isn't just necessarily diversity metrics as you might think. It really means we need to make sure that when we are projecting images of people and solving problems, that people from the communities that we're serving are part of this equation. Taking it back up, I want to just talk about how important it is to twin data with a check. There's so much to be done. And certainly, really data has been perfected, I think, to do some things that make a ton of money that are profoundly unimportant. I think we need to bring the data practices that we do to creating the tiny bell on Twitter that lets you know someone has retweeted, or that really allow a company to send you new spring dresses on a day when that's kind of sunny in your neighborhood because of data collection that allows people to know on a spring day someone in my demographic may want to purchase a floral dress. These things are important. I'm sure companies need these tools. But imagine if we're applying this level of real-time data to truly difficult public problems. You've heard the challenges and the opportunity and the mission-critical role data has played in tackling COVID-19. But if you think about families that need rental assistance today, food assistance, that if you brought a fraction of the level of data that we're bringing to competitive marketing to really getting families out of crisis, we'd have a profoundly different impact. So before we jump to the question area, I want to just pull us back up and remind us that data is powerful, but truly imperfect and reflects our existing imperfections. If data is really going to help, it needs to be, as Built for Zero and the Community Solutions team built, real time, allow you to see the picture of the problem you're solving today, not the picture of the problem you're solving like opioids 18 months earlier. You cannot act with the type of interventions that we need in cities and states, in public-private sector partnerships with the level of data delay that we currently have. Finally, I'm a data evangelist, but I think it's truly important when we're working with big data to have a simple check by talking to humans. Amin Rat did that through his own personal network, but really making sure that if you're making assumptions about 400,000 or 4 million people, that you have a qualitative process that engages typical use cases from these data sets. It is not enough to rely on the data alone. It needs to be checked with an analysis of user experience. And more importantly, I think it really needs to be checked with a level of open-ended questions that don't allow researchers to apply assumptions so people are working in a qualitative way inside a box that isn't relative to them. Finally, who cares about this data if we don't do anything about it? It's remarkable the amount of data analysis and excellent white papers that observe a problem or a trend. There's profoundly more problem observation data in the world than there is problem solving data instrumentation. And I think that is really where this community, which brings a number of partnerships together, has a chance to play and make a difference. I think I'll leave it there. I'm delighted to jump into questions and answers with you all. Perhaps maybe start to pour your questions into this. I'm so grateful to be among folks who are working so hard at bringing these practices to really solve problems in their community in New Jersey. I've found the leaders in the state of New Jersey, in the Department of Labor, and in the digital services offices to be among the most forward-leaning data stewards in the nation. And I'm here, maybe Anne-Marie, I'll turn it back over to you to start anchoring some questions.
That'd be great. Thank you so much. What I'm really liking is that the points that you're making work so well with the points that were made yesterday, and it comes together in a nice round picture of what data can and should be doing. I would like to start off with a question, if I may. I want to talk about often in looking at the problem and deciding how to use data to solve a problem, you start with a large committee. And I want to have a conversation about how to get out of committee-itis and get into sort of the fine point and sort of move out of that committee to make it more detailed, as you say, that it comes down to the specific, and make an audacious goal that maybe a committee at a risk-averse place like a university might not necessarily be willing to take. Have you been dealing with larger groups, and how do you help them to get down to a single point?
It's a really great question, Anne-Marie, and I have a strong committee aversion, I will confess. But it's not impossible. And in some ways, the work of Built for Zero and Community Solutions is a really excellent model. The truth is that to make transformational change on tough things like ending homelessness, or in other instances, eradicating a certain type of disease from a community, or there's all forms of ways to get to zero. For example, as a country right now, our attempt to, get to zero non-vaccination, a goal that took the United States 24 years after the polio vaccine was established. I do think there's some things we can't do alone, so you need the committee. But also a committee in which, 9 members have 9 different goals isn't really worth sitting around talking about your collective impact, I think. So we've often found that having kind of a subset of leaders, these goals in which a shared goal is a good way to really bring people together, is certainly not easy. And I think where the shared goal can advance everyone's work, that's really the sweet spot. And there may be places in which a collective goal is impossible, right? And the goal is to have kind of the collective research be greater than the sum of its parts. That may mean that the shared goal is a definition you all use and the research looks very different. But I think it's a really important challenge in being honest about what can be done by committee and what can't. And really, I think the chair matters a great deal. And a well-organized meeting, clarity on goals, or saying, actually, this is two committees and you guys should be over here and we should be over here with two goals, can make a huge difference.
Okay, we also had another question come in. Are there specific things the federal government can do to facilitate better data usage at the municipal level? And will the new infrastructure plan help?
Yes. I think the new infrastructure plan both it has funding resources across a number of big public programs that I think will allow improvements in data infrastructure. I mean, to be very specific, there's, for example, $2 billion of modernization unemployment insurance dollars. A key part of that is going to need to be how we improve who we can see getting stuck and coming through the system. And that will be muscle built at the state level in a bunch of public-private partnerships. But I think there's no way to get from where we are without better data instrumentation to improve UI. That's just one of probably hundreds of examples. Some of the early executive orders out of the Biden administration have been very clear about data as a priority. So the second piece I'd say on the role of federal government is, the federal government is a tremendous source of data, right? The biggest challenge, I think, for communities on the front line is that so much of the data starts at the community level, rolls up to an agency, gets cleared up, and then comes back to all of us 1 year later. And that doesn't really help if you are trying to tackle policing in your community, improve, measure in real time carbon emissions. So I think lighter weight models at the state and federal level to build, as Built for Zero did, as you see with a number of communities building their own kind of community-based climate data that are in collaboration with how they roll up to the federal, is a kind of bottom-up piece of it. How we collect demographic data, solving problems for the average American is not the same as solving problems for, women of color. And so I think incumbent upon us to see where our shortfalls are and how we're delivering is to collect data in a way that allows us to say, wow, we don't even have enough data on Native Americans to say how we're doing here. And so I think a big role for the federal government, and there's been some shifts already, is creating clarified definitions that allow all of our demographic data to add up to see how well we're serving everyone.
I think that comes back a little bit to your point that you made when you were talking about sometimes you need to collect some data to realize what data you really need to collect. I have a question here that came in from George. He asks, what kind of tools have you been using to utilize data for dashboards, visualization, modeling? What kind of data sets do you primarily look at?
That's an awesome question. And I'll say, it really runs the gamut, to some very sophisticated, Esri-based tools. I'll say most of the time, the pieces that have been the biggest problem-solving hack have been very basic Google Sheets, Excel. And I don't want to kind of undercut the importance of kind of bigger pieces, but giving you a simple example, a lot of times the government data systems inside a single agency are quite sophisticated. People purchase from any number of the top data companies, off the shelf kind of dashboards. But the call center uses this one, and the the website uses this one, and they do not meet. And so in the end, you need someone who grabs the raw data from these four things, pops them in a spreadsheet, and runs pretty basic analysis. So I think in some ways the tools have outpaced the problem refining use of data, in that you can have a lot of ways to slice what you're looking at without really having what I think of as a numerator and denominator for most public services, right? A lot of how many garbage cans do we have, and how many of them have been collected today? I mean, maybe I'd be really curious to just ask, can I ask everyone a question and just say, what is the time window in which you review data? Hourly, daily, weekly? For a snapshot, I'm looking at a quarter, would folks mind indulging me in popping into the chat? I mean, I think, great. This is a data crowd. Everyone's looking frequently, but I think the ability to see, I think a lot of people have the ability to see what's happening now. I find quite frequently that the remarkable data provided by the census is not often used to create a kind of denominator of the possible. So even in New Jersey, we worked on paid leave. There's a denominator of, like, if you look at, there's many different types of families that are eligible in New Jersey for paid leave, ranging from self-care. But if you take a kind of single use case for birth parents, you can generally predict the number of births in New Jersey using census data. And that data is not like what's available in the system that allows you to see how many birth parents are signing up for paid leave. But if you really want to know how you're doing, you want to have a denominator of what is the universe of people who should be getting paid leave with a numerator of who are the folks who are coming to our site. And even further, in most public sector settings, people are not coming, the data collected is coming into, again, call center data or online applications versus paid applications. And so a very simple effort to take from very sophisticated data systems, 4 of them, to a spreadsheet of like, how are we doing numerator against denominator? Who are we trying to serve and who are we reaching? Is a somewhat different exercise than often the kind of great dashboards provided by a bunch of fantastic companies that are sold to cities and states and the federal government.
I'm going to ask a final question. So a lot of our attendees today are from the academic side. You have government side, you have the public side. You've been working with a lot of agencies, and you have industry, the academic side, working at Georgetown. Can you talk a little bit about what you see as the big opportunity and the major need for what academics need to do right now?
I'm so glad you asked about this, Anne Marie. And I think, I think there's kind of a revolution happening at the teaching level, and between what I can just see in some of your centers and amazing work on census data at Keene, that there are great centers and partnerships where I think academic research is really at the cutting edge and has the resources to advance some of these private and public sector conversations by being focused on it. I have found in my work, especially with public policy students, in some ways a gap between what we force graduate students to learn on the data side and what is the best academic research cutting practices, and frankly, what we need for the world of problem solving. And so the more, and I know a number of you are doing this, that we can move our students onto kind of live sandbox data analysis. Many of my graduate students get too much economics for people who are not going to be economists and too much kind of muscly regression analysis and not enough practicum that it will allow them to tell whether they're really applying and making deductions in context. And so I think really shifting how we teach in a way that emphasizes data collection that calculates for human behavior as we know it, not human behavior as we taught it in an economic context for a long time, and really training our students to the best way I've found to do this is to train the students in these live studies. I think the work that Carnegie Mellon has done that is a combo of kind of the Health and Human Services work in Allegheny County going back 20 years, pretty sophisticated use of data in the public sector, having such a great research university in the mix, collaboration between students and public sector partners has been just truly remarkable and makes for super interesting case studies. Many of the case studies I found, part of the reason I wrote the book was I didn't feel I had enough live, meaningful cases that animated for my students the transformative power of these skills, but that really kept up with the times. It was feeling bad to give them case studies that felt like from another era before the internet was invented. And so I think the more you can do to bring the kind of practice as it is, these public problems into the classroom, a ton of it is happening in individual research from professors. I don't think quite as much is being taught in the fundamental space.
That's great. Thanks. That is actually one of the things that I most enjoyed in your book was the practical examples that would allow me to understand your point. I mean, it really resonated. So thank you very much. I really want to thank you for taking the time. Thank you for writing the book. I hope that people in the audience are going to take advantage of getting a copy. As I said, highly recommended, as does President Obama. So thank you very much, Tara. I appreciate your time.
Thank
And
you.
now-
I'm so grateful to be here. Don't hesitate to be in touch.